Chicago in the 1920s, an era of jazz, glamour, and vice. The city was alive with the energy of a nation roaring into a new age. But beneath the surface lay a darker reality, where organized crime ruled the streets. And at the center of it all, one man would become synonymous with power, wealth, and violence: Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Scarface, rose from humble beginnings to become the most notorious crime boss in American history. His story is one of ambition, ruthlessness, and eventual downfall, an empire built on crime, brought down by the very laws he flaunted. Early life. Brooklyn beginnings. Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents. The young Al grew up in a rough neighborhood where survival depended on toughness and quick thinking. He dropped out of school in the 6th grade after a teacher hit him, and soon after, he joined street gangs that prowled the city. Moving to Chicago, the rise to power. In 1920, Al Capone moved to Chicago, where Johnny Torrio was running a burgeoning empire of gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging. The Prohibition era had begun, banning the production and sale of alcohol. This gave rise to an illegal industry that would make Capone a millionaire. Capone quickly proved himself as Torrio's right-hand man, using a combination of business acumen and brute force. When Torrio was nearly killed in an assassination attempt in 1925, he handed control of the empire to Capone, who was just 26 years old. Under Capone's leadership, the Chicago outfit grew even more powerful. Capone made millions through bootlegging, bribing law enforcement and city officials, and eliminating rivals with ruthless efficiency. The violence of Prohibition. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone's reign was marked by violence. The most infamous example of this came on February 14, 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a wall and gunned down by men dressed as police officers. Though Capone was never directly linked to the massacre, it was clear to everyone that he was behind it. The message was simple: no one crossed Al Capone and lived to tell the tale. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a turning point. It cemented Capone's reputation as a ruthless leader, but it also drew the attention of the federal government. The public began to see Capone as a symbol of everything wrong with organized crime and corruption. Despite his violent methods, Capone cultivated an image as a modern-day Robin Hood. He opened soup kitchens during the Great Depression and made sure that people in Chicago had food on their tables. To some, he was a hero, someone who stood up to the establishment and shared his wealth with the poor. But behind the smiles and the charity was a man who would stop at nothing to maintain control. Capone's wealth allowed him to bribe police, judges, and politicians, effectively buying protection from the law. But there was one man who refused to be bought: Elliot Ness. Elliot Ness and the Untouchables. In 1930, the federal government formed a special unit to take down Capone, led by a young Prohibition agent named Elliot Ness. Ness and his team, known as the Untouchables, targeted Capone's operations, raiding his breweries and disrupting his supply lines. Ness's relentless pursuit of Capone put pressure on the crime boss, but it was ultimately the work of accountants that would lead to Capone's downfall. Unable to convict him on charges of murder or bootlegging, the government turned to a lesser-known law: tax evasion. The fall, conviction, and imprisonment. In 1931, Al Capone was charged with tax evasion. The government had painstakingly gathered evidence of his undeclared income, and after a highly publicized trial, Capone was found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Capone's imprisonment marked the end of his criminal empire. He was sent to the infamous Alcatraz prison, where he would spend the next several years, his power and influence stripped away. At Alcatraz, Capone's health began to deteriorate. He suffered from syphilis, which had gone untreated for years. By the time he was released in 1939, he was a shadow of the man who had once ruled Chicago. The final years, a diminished man. Capone spent his final years in seclusion at his estate in Florida, suffering from the effects of his illness. He lived quietly, far from the power and wealth he had once commanded. By the end of his life, Capone was no longer the fearsome figure he had once been. He was mentally diminished, and his criminal empire had long since crumbled. He died in 1947 at the age of 48. Legacy: the legend of Al Capone. Al Capone remains one of the most infamous figures in American history. His life has been the subject of countless books, movies, and television shows, a symbol of the excess and corruption of the Prohibition era. But beyond the myth lies the reality of a man who used violence and fear to build an empire, only to watch it fall apart. Al Capone's story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful can be brought down by the law. In the end, Al Capone was not defeated by rival gangsters or bullets, but by the persistence of those who believed in justice. And that is the legacy that endures.